Pick. Just about there. Okay. It now looks correct on YouTube. Hooray. Give it another minute for people to log in. How about if I remember to put my phone on mute this time, so we don't get interrupted by the various text messages, phone calls, and other things that happen. I mean, after all, for most of human history, we have not been accessible 24/7. I think we can take an hour out of our day to just focus on one thing. And that one thing being Torah, I think makes it even better. All right, we are past our 12 o'clock time, so let's go ahead and get started. We are picking up our story in Miketz here in Genesis 41. And we're going to pick up near the end of the of this section, verse 53. Obviously, a lot has happened since last week's discussion. A lot has happened since the end of last week's parasha. Joseph was sold into slavery. He served Potiphar, ended up in prison, ended up serving Pharaoh, and now we know has interpreted Pharaoh's dream and implemented a policy of storage that will protect the country against the famine that is to come, the 7 years of terrible harvest. And that's really where our story is picking up here on in verse 53, is picking up with the end of the good years and the beginning of the bad years. So mentally, we have to have ourselves in the right frame of mind. We have just had 7 incredible years of harvest, and under Joseph's leadership, there has been a surplus that has been carefully stored during those 7 years. And that is bringing us to verse 53. There came to an end the 7 years of plenty that had occurred in the land of Egypt. And there started to come the 7 years of famine, as Joseph had said. Famine occurred in all lands, but in all the land of Egypt there was bread. All right, so we get the beginning explanation here that the years of plenty, of full satiation are coming to their end, and now there is a famine. You'll notice the phrase, which we'll look at in more detail, explaining that the famine occurred in all lands, bechol ha'aratzot. As we'll see, this is not the all lands that you might have imagined, because that would have been problematic. We'll look at what it is limited to in our commentary, but the sages pointed out, just by means of seichel, of thought and logic, that if this meant the entire world, as bechol ha'aretz can sometimes mean, then what would people have done who lived too far away from Egypt to be able to eat? You couldn't expect somebody living in the outer Mongolian regions or the tip of Africa, let alone anybody living in the Americas, to have made a journey to Egypt to get food to then return back to their nation. So this is one of those little clues that when anyone says, "Oh, I read the Bible literally," they are falling into some pitfalls, because if you were to believe that the entire world, which this phrase could mean, was currently suffering from a famine, then the entire world should have died off, except for the parts closest to Egypt geographically. And that's only assuming that Egypt had enough food to even begin to feed people beyond its local region, which I think would be expecting a lot from the storage plans. So why is it there? Well, the phrase bechol ha'aratzot might be there as a rhetorical flourish, because it is paralleled in the second clause, bechol eretz Mitzrayim, and in all the land of Egypt. So all the other lands are contrasted with all of the land of Egypt. It makes a very nice literary structure to explain that everywhere outside was bad and everywhere inside was okay. And of course, this emphasis on lechem, on bread, that was the staple food for all sedentary societies, whether it was made from wheat, barley, or in other climates made from other domesticated crops. This was the centerpiece of the caloric intake for most people. Verse 55. Then all the land of Egypt felt the famine, and the people cried out to Pharaoh for bread. So Pharaoh said to the Egyptians, "Go to Joseph. Whatever he says to you, do." All right, so again, we have to try and figure out, well, why are we saying there's a famine in Egypt? I thought they had prepared. Well, there is still a famine. Yes, they had definitely prepared for this, but that food was prepared in Pharaoh's possession through Joseph's process. Thus, the nation of Egypt, the actual people, the rank and file, they are experiencing the famine just as anyone else in the area is experiencing the famine, meaning that your average householder doesn't have food. And so they are turning to Pharaoh, who is their king, and Pharaoh says, "Go to Joseph and do what he says." Now, we get another emphasis here. Now the famine was over all the surface of the earth. Joseph opened up all, meaning all the storehouses in which there was grain, and gave out rations to the Egyptians, since the famine was becoming stronger in the land of Egypt. For those of you who have never lived through a famine, and God willing, none of us ever will, understand that historically there would be a winding down of food supplies in the local homeowner, the local community, the region, and then you would have a national issue. So the famine doesn't begin just by throwing a light switch and all of a sudden there's no more food. The food amount tapers off, and there's always hope during a famine that something else will be growing, something else will come to harvest, something else will survive whatever the problem is, whether it be drought or insects or blight. And then as that continues to fail, as the crops continue to yield less and less, then the famine becomes more and more severe. As humans can survive on a reduced calorie diet for a while, but eventually too reduced or for too long is going to cause major health problems and, of course, death. So it's a very accurate description of what we would expect during this. And perhaps also it is a very accurate description of the human reaction, that the people are not quite already prepared for the issue of the famine, that the people are gradually being forced into the realization that indeed this is going to happen. Now, that's a great little human insight there, that they were willing to go along with the requirements during the 7 years of plenty because they had plenty. Now that they have too little, people become more difficult, more harder to manage. And that's what we're seeing play out here. By going to Pharaoh, go to Joseph, it's the tension within the nation is becoming strong. But outside the nation, verse 57 tells us, "And all the lands came to Egypt to buy rations to Joseph, for the famine was strong in all lands." So the famine was not only localized in Egypt. Had it only been localized in Egypt, Egypt might have been able to import food from other areas. But since the famine affected a much larger area, that meant that Egypt was well served by Joseph's interpretation as well as his planning to make sure that they would have enough. And they had so much that other nations could come and supplement their meager stores by purchasing the food from Egypt. And that meant, of course, going to Joseph, which is going to set us up for the eventual reunification of Joseph and his brothers as they come looking to buy food. All right, questions or comments before we dive into our commentary? Okay, so what's so bad about a famine? I mean, I know that sounds almost like a comical question because we all take it for granted. Famines are terrible. But Why exactly? What is it like to go through a famine? Um, Most of us, as I said, I hope, have never gone through a famine situation. At most, some of us have fasted for Yom Kippur, I hope, if you're physically capable, and gone a day without eating voluntarily, likewise for Tisha B'Av. But that's not quite the same thing. One, it's a single day, and that means your body barely has time to register the sudden drop off of calories. Even if you feel a little hungry, it's nothing like the hunger that comes from a famine. Two, it is something that is scheduled, meaning you know when Yom Kippur is coming, and you know how to prepare if you wish to eat larger amounts in the days leading up, to do what is necessary to make it as least difficult as possible, which, by the way, for Yom Kippur is an important technique, and one that is even strongly encouraged. Yom Kippur is not supposed to elicit suffering, it is supposed to elicit thoughtfulness. So by all means, take the proper preparations and steps, just like Joseph did for Egypt. And three, we are still in the company of food, even throughout Yom Kippur. I mean, certainly you're probably at shul, but you know that your pantry at home still has some food in it. And even if you might experience some level of food insecurity in the US, mostly it is a diminished amount of what would be considered the situation of famine. That is to say, those who go through famine are not merely facing food insecurity. They are not just having to cut back a little bit on meals. That may be the beginning of the famine, but they are going without anything and not knowing where more can be found. That is the underlying most important aspect to really understand about a famine, is that you are hungry because you have nothing, and you believe, because you've looked desperately, that there isn't anything available to find that will be in sufficient quantity to feed everyone. This is why a famine can cause the entire breakdown of a society. Because if one family is starving and they think that their neighbors have food, then they're going to try and take it from their neighbors. And likewise, if one town feels they're starving, but the next town has plenty, then you're going to have civil strife. So famines are incredibly dangerous to the individual, and they are incredibly dangerous to the society. Thus, Joseph's planning was not merely a humanitarian plot, it was also a governmental plot. Pharaoh could easily have collapsed, and indeed many governments, both in the Near East as well as the rest of the world, have collapsed due to famines. But to try and get a better idea of just how bad famines are, we need to look at the words from people who lived through famines. And our tradition is full of discussions of famine because until the modern world, most people in most parts of the world knew what a famine was. They might survive, or at least survive with diminished health or diminished family members, but famines were a common companion in most parts of the world until the modern era. It is a miracle how well we are able to feed how many, and we have continued to make improvements, reducing the amount of famines that were common even when I was growing up. So in 40, 50 years, we have fewer people now suffering from famine or food insecurity than we did 40, 50 years ago, despite the fact that the world population has grown. So yes, we are in a better place, but let's listen to the people who were not. Beginning in Bava Batra, this is from the Talmud, famine is worse than the sword. They're talking about the various problems of warfare here. If you wish, say that it is derived by means of logical reasoning. That is to say, we don't even need a particular verse to prove to us that famine is worse than the sword, because we can figure it out by logic. Meaning, this one, the person who dies of famine, suffers greatly before departing from this world. But that one, the one who dies by the sword, does not suffer. So if you had to pick a way of going, would you choose months and months of slowly fading away on ever diminishing meager rations until your body finally goes through all of the systemic failures induced by hunger? Or would you rather just be killed with a sword, have your head cut off and be dead in an instant. If you had to choose, I'm sure most people would actually prefer the sword. Now, that's not the way it usually works out because we don't usually get to choose A or B. And even those suffering from famine will usually choose to continue to suffer in the hope that food will become available and they will not ultimately die. And thus, humans go to great lengths to stretch out their lifespan despite famine in that hope. However, if you wish, say instead of the fact that famine is worse than sword is learned from a verse. We can point to a verse that tells us the same thing. More fortunate were the victims of the sword than the victims of famine, taken from the Book of Lamentations, which is also known as Eicha, read on Tisha B'Av, read in commemoration of the many horrible tragedies that befell our people on that day. And there very clearly Tanakh is saying that indeed being killed by famine is much worse than being killed by the sword. And just as a reminder, especially for our current time, and captivity is worse than all of them. It includes all of them, famine, sword, and death. As we continue to be mindful of those that are suffering in captivity in Gaza, let us remember that this is an even worse position to be in. Those that are free but suffering from famine, those that are killed by the sword in an instant, they have in some ways a better lot than those that are slowly starving while captive, being treated horribly and the physical abuse, only to then be killed at the end, either through mistreatment or direct murder. Captivity is indeed the worst of all of those fates. And that's why we continue to remember those captives and continue to pray for their quick and hopefully healthy release. Turning from the Talmud, from the general, we look in the specific in Tanakh, taken here from 2 Kings 6. Sometime later, King Ben-Hadad of Aram mustered his entire army and marched upon Samaria and besieged it. This was the standard military practice of the day. It was hard to get over the walls of an enemy city. The usual thing to do was simply to surround the city and prevent any food from being brought in and starve the city into submission. Why risk your soldiers on the walls of a city that's well defended when you can simply let them eat themselves to death by finishing off their food and then having nothing? They will be much more agreeable to sue for surrender or other forms of capitulation. And so there was a great famine in Samaria, in the city, and the siege continued until a donkey's head sold for 80 shekels of silver and a quarter cob of dove's dung for 5 shekels. All right, so this is an inflationary description. Now, those of you who are familiar with kashrut will know that donkeys are not kosher, and thus eating them is prohibited. However, if the only food you have to eat is a donkey head, which would be the worst of worst of worst, then you eat it to stay alive. But if there are too few donkey heads to go around, strange sentence to make, then the price of the donkey head is going to continue to rise as this very scarce commodity, food, is ever more valuable to the starving people of the city. Likewise, the dung, not a suitable food source, but when people are desperate, they will put anything in their mouth in the hope that it will provide them with some help. So, once, when the king of Israel was walking on the city wall, a woman cried out to him, "Help me, your majesty." "Don't ask me," he replied. "Let God help you. Where could I get help for you, from the threshing floor or from the winepress? But what troubles you?" So the king is answering her and saying, look, you can beg for help, but I've got no food, right? There is no food for the city. So what are you asking for? And her request is heartbreaking. The woman answered, "That woman said to me, 'Give up your son and we will eat him today. And tomorrow we'll eat my son.' So we cooked my son and we ate him." So the people have begun resorting to cannibalism. And as was common throughout the global communities, children are often the first to die or come close to death because of famine. And as such, they were making an agreement that they would eat each other's children, and they would share one child the first day, and then they would share the second child the next day. And they did. This woman served up her child and shared it with this woman. The next day I said to her, give up your son and let's eat him. But she hid her son. So this is her complaint. It is a civil matter, a matter of a lawsuit, taking her to a small claims court, if you will, because they had made a deal. The deal was to share the meat from the children, and she shared her portion, and her neighbor has not shared her portion. As such, her neighbor has defrauded her, and there needs to be proper recompense. You can see that the mentality of the city has completely changed under the pressures of famine. That this is not just a city that is suffering and moaning and crying. This is a city whose entire sense of value of what is right, what is wrong, of what is even normal, has been warped by the pain of famine. When you go to the king without any shame, arguing over the fact that you made this deal and she reneged, and you're not arguing about the fact that your child is dead, you're arguing about the fact that she hasn't given you the meat from her child, then you can realize just how far the city has fallen. The view of the world is completely different than it was before the famine began. And when the king heard what the woman said, he rent his clothes. And as he walked along the wall, the people could see that he was wearing sackcloth underneath. So the king tears at his clothes, which was not considered normal. The king was supposed to always be in honored and dignified clothing, but he is weeping that his city has fallen this far. And people can see now through the tear in his clothes that even though he was keeping up the appearances of wearing the beautiful royal clothes underneath, he was wearing sackcloth, which was a sign of repentance and of pleading to God for an end to the siege and thus an end to the famine. That is an example of how terrible things can reach. But it was not only in biblical times. If we look also in the Talmud here in Gittin 56a, we can see that during the siege of Jerusalem, this was by the Romans in 70 CE, that famine was just as brutal. Marta bat Baitos was one of the wealthy women of Jerusalem. She sent out her agent and said to him, go bring me fine flour. So there was different grades of flour. The finest was the purest wheat flour, milled most nicely, and then you would go down the list. By the time he went, the fine flour was already sold. He came and said to her, there is no fine flour, but there is ordinary flour. She said to him, go then and bring me ordinary flour. By the time he went, the ordinary flour was also sold. He came and said to her, there is no ordinary flour, but there is coarse flour. She said to him, go then and bring me coarse flour. By the time he went, the coarse flour was already sold. He came and said to her, there is no coarse flour, but there is barley flour. She said to him, go then and bring me barley flour. But once again, by the time he went, the barley flour was also sold. All right, so we're going to pause there. What we are seeing here is not just a children's tale, a fable of how people could be so stupid. I mean, obviously, the normal behavior would have been to say, go to the market and buy whatever you can find. The city is under siege. Everyone should know that this is a siege and that food is going to become scarce. Why the go and back, the back and forth, back and forth, back and forth? Well, it is trying to tell us a couple things. One, it's trying to tell us that there were people in Jerusalem at the time of the siege who were so wealthy that it never occurred to them that there might not be food. And it never occurred to them that they should tell the agent to just buy whatever was available, because of course they would expect whatever would be best. And likewise, that servant had to expect that his mistress would not be happy with him bringing home something that she had not approved. She may never have eaten even regular flour in her entire life. And as such, if he were to bring it back, she might become very angry at him. And this is the fundamental disconnect among this segment of the population to what is the norm. You can see here she's never really been to the market herself. She doesn't go with the agent to approve. It would be unbecoming for a woman of her stature to go to the market in the first place. This is the level that she lived at. Now, that's being told to us so that, one, we can appreciate that indeed Jerusalem was that fine of a city, but we can also then make the comparison between the amazing status of Jerusalem before the Roman destruction and the eventual status of Jerusalem after that destruction. You can't understand the pain and destruction of a city until you realize just how magnificent it was, and this is one way of trying to show that. We are currently in our school doing a project with our students, showing them Jerusalem at different stages of history, and we just went over this level of Jerusalem's height when it was under the largest expansion prior to the destruction by the Romans in 70, and we're showing them the comparison of what Jerusalem looked like in the intervening centuries until the modern world, and how the city was devastated and has not really recovered until the modern times, until the 1900s. Even before 1948, Jerusalem was a pale reflection of what she was at this time in her history. Obviously now, with the new city of Jerusalem thriving and looking gorgeous, we have come a long way in a very short time. Now, what is the final end to this story? When she finds out that there is no barley, she's by that time she had just removed her shoes, but she said, "I will go out myself and see if I can find something to eat." She stepped on some dung, which stuck to her foot, and overcome by disgust, she died. So again, we finish off with this idea that this wealthy woman was of such refined character that not only had she never even considered lesser flour or going to the market herself, that merely coming into contact with the real filth that was in the city was enough to kill her. That she had reached that level of fastidiousness that had been the benefit of living within this wealthy enclave all her life. Okay, so that's a broad view, and obviously Tanakh has much more to say about famine, as does rabbinic literature. But I want to return to our discussion of Joseph and the situation in Egypt. So as I promised, Bereshit Rabbah explains to us there was famine in all lands. That was our quote taken from the text. In 3 lands. That's what they mean by all: Phoenicia, Arabia, and Philistia. So in addition to Egypt itself, there were famines in the Phoenician lands, the Philistine lands, and the Arabian territories. Those are the areas that were without food. Now, that would have, of course, included the Canaanite territory where Jacob and the remaining sons were living. But as you can see, they have no problem in the Midrash explaining that all the lands does not mean every land on the planet. As we talked about earlier, that would be logically impossible. Instead, it means the immediate neighbors, both to explain why those people were coming to Egypt and why Egypt could not go to them. All right, so logic prevails. But let's continue with Bereshit Rabbah, trying to explain the interchange between Joseph and the nation and Pharaoh as this famine unfolds. We didn't talk about it as we went through the reading initially because I wanted to leave it for this discussion, but it is a little unusual, as is often the case when we read through the texts. There are questions that suggest themselves that don't seem to make perfect sense in the text already. So we read through here and it says that the famine occurred, and it says that in all of Egypt there was bread, but then it says the people are crying out to Pharaoh. Well, why were people crying out? Why wasn't it automatic that the bread was being distributed? The grain at the very least, or even the flour, they've been storing it. They have enough. Why does there need to be an outcry? Why is there any? Why didn't it simply said there was in all of the lands of Egypt there was bread and Joseph distributed it to everyone? That would have been the most simple version of the story, but that's not what happened. Now, what did happen? Well, that's where Midrash has to come in and help us, because Midrash is going to explain to us, why did the people go to Pharaoh if Pharaoh was just going to tell them go to Joseph? And that is where that's what we're going to work on. Okay, so Jacob saw that there was grain in Egypt, right? So this is, from the outside point of view, the introductory phrase, as the Midrash often does. Well, it is written. And indeed, Midrash Rabbah is an example of a Midrash that doesn't take each verse slice by slice, but instead takes each verse and will often bring parallel verses from other parts of Tanakh to use as a explanatory tool for the verse in question. And this time we're going to the book of Proverbs. The withholder of grain, the nation will curse him, but blessing will be on the head of the provider. All right, in context in Proverbs, that seems pretty straightforward. If you supply grain to people, they're going to be happy. If you don't, they're going to get mad. Okay, so what do we do with this A, B, the withholder versus the provider? Well, the withholder of the grain, the nation will curse him. This is Pharaoh, who hoarded the grain during the years of famine, and the people were cursing him. So the first interpretation here is that the reason people are going to Pharaoh is because Pharaoh was reluctant to share. He hoarded the grain. Remember, there are always alternatives to how things were done, how they could have been done, and Pharaoh did not need to hoard the grain the way he did. So we can understand the people went crying out to Pharaoh in an act not of petition, but of anger, because Pharaoh was not distributing the grain properly. On the other hand, who did? Who was the provider? Joseph. Joseph sustained the world during the years of famine like a shepherd leading his flock. Now, that phrase may seem a little out of left field, but let us see. As David said, taken from the book of Psalms, "Shepherd of Israel, listen, appear to us, you who led Joseph like a flock." We see Joseph in the connection to a flock, and we see the idea of the one providing as being given like a shepherd, because after all, that's the phrase David's using to God when he is petitioning God. And how do we explain this, says the Midrash? When there was a famine during the days of David, he asked for mercy and said, "Master of the universe," one of the many titles for God, "lead your flock like Joseph, who sustained the world during the years of famine." So their interpretation of Psalms is that David is saying to God, be like a shepherd to us, the way Joseph was a shepherd to the people of Egypt. Just as he provided to the people, so too, God, please provide to us and end our famine. Thus rendering Joseph as being the one who was considered the true provider, the true sustainer for the people, which is then contrasted with Pharaoh. So that's one way to interpret this section. We have Pharaoh withholding, we have Joseph providing. However, there is a less celebratory, from the Egyptian point of view, way of looking at this exchange. And that's our next paragraph. Let's see if I can get most of this, all of this on one? No, can't get all of it. All right, well, we'll get all of the next paragraph. That'll do for now. When the famine intensified, the Egyptians gathered and came to Joseph. Again, as I mentioned, the early days of the famine, people are going to be living off what they currently have and the failing crops. And eventually they are going to need to get the food supply. They're going to need the supplemental government assistance. So they come to Joseph. They said to him, "Give us bread," right? That's your job, right? You're the guy who was appointed. Excuse me. Sorry for interrupting. You were the one who was appointed to gather our surplus in order that we would have food during this famine that you had predicted. So bread, right? Now it's, you're part of the bargain. he said to them, "My God does not sustain the uncircumcised. Go and circumcise yourselves, and I will give to you." All right, so Joseph uses his position to encourage demand that the Egyptians become circumcised. And indeed, circumcision was not, well, it has a long history in Egypt. It's not perfectly even of where it was practiced and when it was practiced and who was under its position. But we do know that it was part of Egyptian culture in different ways. But here Joseph is saying, no, no, all of you need to be circumcised because I will not provide unless you provide, unless you do this. Now, you can imagine the people were unhappy with this. They went to Pharaoh and were crying out and weeping before him. As it is stated, the entire land of Egypt was hungry, and the people cried out to Pharaoh for bread. He said, "Go to Joseph. What he says to you, you shall do." So, what is this trying to explain? It's trying to explain that hiccup in the text of there was bread in Egypt, and yet the people go to Pharaoh and are crying out. Why are they crying out? Well, as we saw, first explanation they cried out was because Pharaoh was hoarding. Second explanation, they're crying out because Joseph has just demanded that they circumcise themselves, and the people are unhappy with that. So they go and they cry to Pharaoh. They are complaining. Joseph is unreasonable. And he's saying, go back to Joseph and do what he tells you to do. So they say to him, we went to him, and he said empty matters to us. He was like, blah, 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 circumcise yourselves. What? I mean, basically they are saying, he didn't give us any bread. He just told us to go circumcise ourselves, which how does that help feed us? What does that have to do with bread? What is going on with this guy? And he said to them, Pharaoh was responding to the mob, "Fools, did I not say to you from the outset, obey him and acquire grain?" Right? That was the pulp of the whole process. Did he not proclaim to you during the years of plenty and command you, know that there is a famine coming? You yourselves were negligent. Why did you not place in your houses grain to last 2, 3, or 4 years? All right, so the first step of this this midrash is to try and help us understand from the outsider point of view why the Egyptians are needing to go to Joseph at all. Because after all, they knew that the famine was coming. Unlike most other countries around the world who don't get a heads up about famine, they knew that a famine was coming, and they knew how long they had to prepare. They knew they could have prepared. And yes, Pharaoh's hinting that maybe they would not have been able to prepare themselves to withstand the entire famine, but surely they could have stockpiled some of the food for themselves to last at least a little while. And yet here we are at the very beginning of the famine. We know that because of when the brothers arrive in year 2. Here we are in the beginning of the famine, and it's like they have nothing. So what was wrong with you people? Why didn't you at least have enough to last you for a little while? Why are you going to Joseph and saying, give us bread this early? And then, yeah, he's giving you an answer that you don't like. But they're going to respond that indeed they did try to prepare. They said to him, the grain that was in our houses rotted. So they're saying, no, look, something happened. We did try to stockpile for the famine, and that grain rotted. So all of our stores were hurt. And that meant we are at the mercy of Joseph much earlier than we were expecting to be. So Pharaoh then responds again, if he issues a decree upon grain and it rots, perhaps he will issue a decree upon us and kill us. He said to them, go to Joseph. If he tells you to cut your flesh, heed him. As it is stated, what he says to you, you shall do. So Pharaoh is putting 2 and 2 together here, or at the very least, he's trying to make the people think that this is what's going on. He says, look, you're trying to say that Joseph made all the grain rot in the land? Well, if he did, then maybe you should probably do what he says. Because after all, if he has the power to destroy the grain in your houses, the grain that you stockpiled for yourself privately, then why don't you imagine that he has the ability to just kill you outright? If he wants to curse you to death, well, Clearly, this guy has powers. Now, as we know, the Egyptians were very beholden to the idea of magic and sorcery. So this probably made perfect sense to them, that indeed they would risk Joseph's wrath, which is what it seems Pharaoh was trying to introduce to them. The concept that rather than ignoring Joseph, maybe you should be afraid of him. And if you really do think he has this power, then maybe you should actually do what he says rather than continuing to be stubborn. Because what do you want me to do? If he wants to curse us all to die, then apparently, by what you think, he has the power to do so. So go and do as he says. And indeed, that's the way the Midrash concludes, that the people go back, they circumcise themselves, and they continue to receive then the rations. The Torah portion goes on in much more detail than later chapters, as the people need food for longer periods. They end up selling everything they own to the Pharaoh, and they end up selling even themselves to Pharaoh, becoming his tenant farmers, sharecroppers, if you will, in perpetuity. Okay, let's go on to the final section here from Bereshit Rabbah to wrap it up. So there's a curious reference in Rashi that this is the expanded version of, which I hope we can understand. The famine was on the entire face of the earth. All right, let's just go back here again to make sure you can see this in the text. So in verse 56, it says, now the famine was all over all the surface of the earth. Well, the Midrash has a problem with that, because we already had that it was in all the lands. What are we adding by saying it was on the face of the land? That seems like an unnecessary redundancy. What is being brought here? And in typical Midrashic fashion, it means that we shouldn't read this as being the face of the land. We are going to find a substitute for that word. As he says, it would have been fitting for the verse to say on the earth. Even better, even if you want to say earth again, we didn't need the word face of the earth. Clearly, that is the intention, the essential element that was added. Why does the verse say on the face? Rabbi Shmuel bar Nachman said, to teach that the famine began with the wealthy, as the face of the earth is the wealthy. All right, what? Hold on. What do we mean by the face of the earth means the wealthy? And what do you mean the famine began with the wealthy? Well, began with the wealthy is fairly easy to explain. It means that the wealthiest people in the society actually felt the sting of the famine first. Now, that is intended to be important to say, because that is the opposite of what is normal. Normally, the wealthy are able to protect themselves from famine for a lot longer than those that are poor. Those that are poor sell the vast majority of what they earn or grow in order to buy the food they need day by day, barely subsisting on what they're able to do. Whereas the rich are usually able to have a surplus, which will protect them, buffer them from any problems in the grain market. But no, this one began with the wealthy, and we know that because it uses the word face of the earth. Now, how does that work? Well, thus the withholder of grain, the nation will curse him. When a person is wealthy, his face is happy to see another. But when a person is indigent, when someone is poor, he does not have a face to see. Why? Well, think of basic biology and posture. If you are full and happy and satisfied and you are walking out among the people, you walk out upright. Your head is up and your face is shining out visibly. When you are miserable, what do? You hang your head, right? Across the planet, humans walk with their face downcast when they are feeling downcast. It is the literal posture of somebody that is in trouble. So, who has a face? The wealthy. They are the ones whose face you can always see. Therefore, the face of the land, the wealthy of the land, the people who are always looking out and up and are smiling, they are the ones who are feeling the famine first, right? And the ones that are too poor, they don't have a face to show because they are ashamed in front of others. That is why it is stated, the withholder of grain, the nation will curse him. If you are walking around head held high and belly nice and full, and everyone else is miserable because they are starving, then you're going to be in trouble. That's where the mob begins to sharpen the pitchforks and light the torches and come storm the palace. But if the famine begins with the wealthy, then that's not going to happen. Again, the Midrash is answering not only the textual irregularity of face of the earth, it is also answering the cultural irregularity of why did the famine play out the way the Torah describes? Because this is unusual. Famines normally happen in the opposite direction, like we saw back in the Talmudic discussion of the wealthy woman who sent her servant. She clearly was at the end of running out of food, where other people had already run out earlier and were buying whatever they could find. So that was the normal direction. Here we're seeing the opposite, because otherwise you would have expected the people to go to the wealthy. They would have gone to the upper class to be fed before they would go to Joseph, especially with the idea that Joseph might be asking them to do something that they don't want to do. So we can see here that both logically as well as textually, this famine had to be different, that there must have been some sort of general problem that wiped out the grain that might have been stored privately, that forced both wealthy and non-wealthy to be beholden to Joseph, and that the nation was therefore at his mercy. This explains why later on we can see the nation being willing to capitulate to all of Joseph's demands, because indeed they had no choice, and the entire nation had no choice. They were put in just that bad of a position, which was even worse and more of a upheaval in the world than a usual famine. But we knew that was coming to some degree, because 7 years of famine is a nightmare. All right, which brings us to our conclusion. Now, obviously, there are many things to learn from this entire section. One of them is put something away, and for the rainy day, we should all be trying to save what we can as necessary, because you don't know when there's going to be a 7-year famine. We don't have Joseph around to interpret those dreams. We also understand that there is a requirement, an obligation, a moral duty for those that have plenty to help those that have less. One of the reasons why we not only encourage people to support local food pantries or Jewish family services, but why we have a direct food pantry on our site, so that if people need something, they can come and take from the little pantry, and if people have extra, they can put it into the pantry. And I can tell you that the pantry is serving a great need in our neighborhood. Many people, not only members of our community, but the broader community of Winter Springs, are using that pantry on a daily basis, both to add to it as well as to take what they need. So whether you're in my community directly or whether you live elsewhere and are watching this on YouTube, make sure you're doing what you can to prepare yourself, take care of your family, and if you can, to take care of others as well. We don't have the prophetic insight of Joseph, and so instead we must rely on logic and goodwill to sustain us when times are tough. Take care, everyone, and as I said, try and take care of each other too. Be well, and Hanukkah Sameach.